The Hamas-Israel conflict remains one of the most enduring and complex confrontations of modern times, and it continues to influence both regional security dynamics and global military thinking. At its core, this conflict is a prominent example of asymmetric warfare, a type of war in which a relatively weaker force employs unconventional methods to challenge a militarily superior adversary. The conflict is not merely a localized dispute between Hamas and Israel. It is part of a much broader political, ideological, and geopolitical struggle, with far-reaching implications for global security and modern military thinking. Historically, the roots of the conflict can be traced back to the late 19th century when the Zionist movement began in Europe, calling for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The turning point came in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, when Britain pledged its support for creating such a homeland in Palestine after occupying the territory during the First World War. Following the partition plan of the United Nations in 1947, the First Arab-Israeli War of 1948 broke out, leading to the creation of Israel and the mass displacement of Palestinians. Nearly 2 decades later, in the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel captured the West Bank and Gaza territories, now known as the Occupied Palestinian Territories. Since then, Israel has maintained a prolonged military occupation. The foundation of Hamas came much later, in 1987. Emerging as an offshoot of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, short for Harakatul Muqawama al-Islamiyya, positioned itself as an Islamist resistance movement dedicated to ending Israeli occupation through armed struggle. Hamas's rise was gradual but steady. While the Oslo Accords of the 1990s attempted to establish a two-state solution, Hamas rejected any peace settlement and continued its armed operations. In 2006, Hamas won a surprise victory in Palestinian legislative elections, and by 2007, it had forcibly taken control of Gaza from its rival faction. This blockade has restricted resources, limited movement, and created severe hardship for the civilian population. The years that followed witnessed repeated cycles of escalation. Armed conflicts erupted in 2008, 2012, 2014, and again in 2021, each of them inflicting heavy civilian casualties, particularly in Gaza. Analysts believe that frustration over prolonged occupation, economic deprivation, and an attempt to derail normalization talks between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States were among the reasons behind Hamas's decision to launch the October 7, 2023 attack. On that day, Hamas launched a coordinated surprise offensive during the Jewish holiday of Shemini Atzeret. The attack began with a massive rocket barrage. Around 5,000 rockets were fired within 20 minutes, temporarily overwhelming Israel's much-vaunted Iron Dome air defense system. This was followed by ground infiltrations, as Hamas fighters used bulldozers, explosives, and motorcycles to breach Israel's fortified border at multiple points. They attacked army outposts, disabled military communications, and entered civilian neighborhoods, taking hostages and spreading chaos. In response, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that Israel was at war. The Israeli Defense Forces launched Operation Iron Sword, which was structured into 3 phases. First, an intensive air campaign to destroy Hamas's operational capacity and infrastructure. Second, a gradual ground invasion aimed at dismantling Hamas's resistance. And third, the establishment of a new long-term security regime in Gaza. The conflict unfolded in stages. In October 2023, Israel conducted continuous air bombardments, targeting Gaza's infrastructure and suspected Hamas strongholds. By November and December, Israeli ground forces invaded northern Gaza, but progress was slow due to Hamas's ambushes, booby-trapped tunnels, and urban warfare. By December, fighting had extended to Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. In early 2024, attention turned to Rafah. Although the operation was initially delayed due to American concerns over humanitarian fallout, Israel eventually launched its Rafah offensive in May 2024. The humanitarian crisis deepened, and on June 10th, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 2735, calling for an immediate ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal. Despite this, negotiations dragged on through the second half of 2024 as Israel insisted on controlling strategic corridors and as regional militias increased their involvement. By late 2024, Israel had renewed its offensives in northern Gaza. Finally, in January 2025, a truce was reached. On January 15th, a ceasefire and hostage exchange agreement was announced, mediated primarily by Qatar and Egypt. On March 18th, 2025, Israel formally resumed full-scale combat with a wave of airstrikes that ended the fragile ceasefire framework. Subsequent weeks saw expanded ground action axes, notably in Gaza City and the Shujaiya sector. In August 2025 alone, 185 individuals died from starvation, with a total of 361 starvation-related deaths reported. Humanitarian organizations have raised alarms over the dire conditions in Gaza. The United Nations has declared a worst-case famine scenario, with over 122 deaths from starvation and more than 28,000 cases of malnutrition reported. The International Association of Genocide Scholars has passed a resolution stating that Israel's actions in Gaza meet the legal definition of genocide. It is also important to note that the fighting in Gaza quickly expanded into a regional confrontation. Hezbollah in Lebanon launched rocket attacks against northern Israel. Houthi rebels in Yemen began targeting global shipping lanes in the Red Sea. And Iran, for the first time in decades, directly attacked Israel with missile and drone barges, most notably in April and again in October 2024. This demonstrates how a local conflict can escalate into a multi-front regional war. The global reaction has been equally significant. In January 2024, South Africa accused Israel of genocide at the International Court of Justice. Across the world, mass protests erupted, particularly in Muslim-majority countries, but also in Western capitals. Initially, most Western nations expressed strong support for Israel. But as the conflict dragged on and civilian deaths in Gaza mounted, international criticism of Israeli actions became louder, even among its closest allies. Hamas-Israel conflict is not merely a battle between a state and a non-state actor. It is a conflict with deep historical roots, carried out through asymmetric and hybrid tactics, and shaped by the involvement of regional and global powers. It is at once a humanitarian tragedy and a strategic case study in modern warfare.